Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. Yeah, to start with, quick reminder, we are on iTunes, Podcast Republic, TuneIn, and now we just figured out how to get on Spotify. So if you go to our Twitter account, our pinned tweet will have all the various ways to listen, in addition to just going to the website, leftanchor.com. And yeah, thanks for all the reviews and comments we've been getting for that. That's been very helpful.
Yes, please keep that up. And we definitely, as some of you know from corresponding with us, appreciate the suggestions for future guests or future topics. And we really do take in the feedback and appreciate it. So just want you to know that. We encourage more of that. Thank you.
So we got a book today. We're reading, I have to say it, because it's my burden to mispronounce every word in all the languages of the world. But this one's called "Winner Take All" by Anand Giridharadas. Apologies.
Sure.
Apologies. As the man once said, I'm from the States, as you can tell by my complete lack of sophistication. But yeah, anyways, this book, it's again called Winner Take All, and it's about basically the philanthropy business. And so it's by a guy who was like an Aspen Ideas scholar. He worked for like the Aspen Institute, that famous gathering that happens in the mountains of Colorado every year, where all the thought leaders get together and they talk about hashtag solutions and hashtag markets and hashtag blah, blah, blah. And he became, somewhat disillusioned with that whole sector of activity. And he wrote a book as a fellow for this place, basically.
I think you should mention the subtitle. I think it's an important subtitle.
What is the subtitle? I didn't write it down.
It's Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world.
Yeah.
Which I think is an important foreshadowing of the argument in text to come.
Yeah, and so this will be part of our what you might call a kind of book club. We're just reading a couple of books now and then, and this one I think is just a very, very interesting and very well written and very sort of quietly devastating portrayal of this particular topic. It's definitely, we'll get into it in a little bit more detail, but it's really a great illustration of the strategy of show, don't tell. I think that's advice that sometimes is kind of overstated. You can just tell sometimes, but this case, he just hangs these people on their own words and actions without, he's very wry and kind of subtle in his own commentary. But yeah, it's just kind of quietly devastating.
So it's a well-written book, both in the devastation of the argument against the elites and the, as we'll see, self-legitimating narratives they tell themselves about what they're up to. And we'll get into what sort of elites he's talking about. But it's written in a compelling way that is, journalistic in the sense that he's telling true stories of particular individuals. And it's, very accessible, very, as you say, show, not tell. And compelling in the argument that is shown through those stories, which makes it, this was published this year in just a couple months ago in August, end of August. Highly recommend it because it does, I think, we've talked recently about fascism and capitalism and Trump and violence. So those right-wing fascist populist reactions, I think, are important to understand. Also important to understand are some of the conditions that gave rise to it that have legitimating myths. And so we can talk more about how this book will help us explore those, I think.
Yeah. There's a quote from an interview that he did with New York Magazine where he says, changing the world had become the wingman of rigging the system. And, basically he's going around to all these conferences and all these, fundraising events where people are doing sort of various forms of charitable activity and sort of viewing the ways in which the delimiting of topics of conversation, the selection of subjects, the exclusion of other subjects, serves in many cases to entrench the power of the wealthy who are funding these type of organizations, and in some of the worst cases can serve as just like little more than an indulgence, from people who are just pillaging society. He goes into a lot of detail about all the various charities that the Sacklers have funded. This is the, I would say arguably the largest global drug dealer in the entire world. They basically have been pushing OxyContin on, the United States and many other countries, but primarily, in the United States. And a primary, if not like the overwhelming force behind the plague of opioid overdoses and deaths, which killed something like 65,000 people last year. And they, these guys were more or less suborning the government of West Virginia, like lobbying so hard to prevent them, as this like fairly feeble West Virginia government tried to like basically mobilize itself to protect the citizenry from this like cancerous epidemic of addictive drugs. And they were, just pushing back at every stage of the political process, electing people, putting money in pockets, and just ferociously arguing against kind of regulatory responses. And then they go to New York and other cities, and they fund the operas and these art galleries and all these other things. Some of which may be like fairly nice in their own way, but like they don't even begin to counterbalance the negative effects of their business.
No, and so I think we should mention the essential thesis, I think, or argument of the book, which is the elites. So he's talking about elites not like Goldman Sachs, not like so many of the terrible forces of disruption and destruction that essentially know they're raping and pillaging and devastating our democracy or putative democratic republic, right? He's specifically talking about the Elon Musks, the Jeff Bezos, and people not nearly that wealthy in Silicon Valley and other places who, unlike perhaps some contingents on Wall Street or in other parts of corporate America, who, unlike those that know they're really just totally taking people for a ride and exploiting and profiting, and they don't really mind. I mean, if you read like Liquidated, the ethnography of Wall Street, you see that the very ethos of Wall Street is the not the win-win, but the win-lose. Like I'm not happy if I win. If you also win, I want you to lose. So there's a lot of that knowing malice and knowing domination and exploitation. He's talking about something else, which is the narratives and the myths of those who think that, as he writes, they are doing well by doing good, and vice versa, right?
Yeah.
So they are making money by doing good for the community, and by doing good for the community, they are making their money. And this is total bullshit, but it is scarily. So the thing he thinks is so dangerous is so many people, both the actual leaders and wealthy purveyors of this narrative and of these enterprises, but also the acolytes and young people coming into the workplace and beyond, buy into this nonsense. And hence, TED Talks and Davos and so many things that we can associate where kind of the just the stroke contest about how do-gooders are just innovating, right? And all these buzzwords, as you say, in order to save the world, how pernicious and dangerous that is. That's what he's trying to really debunk and expose.
Yeah. The Sacklers are the extreme case. But yeah, on the other half of the equation, you have people who maybe they don't, their business is just like an ordinary business. They're not doing anything that's super destructive, but what they are doing is making tons and tons and tons of money because of, the evolution of neoliberalism over the past 30 years. And they're taking that money and they're sort of, they're using their enormous power that money gives them to say that whatever sort of harms that we are trying to ameliorate here are going to take place in a way that does not threaten the, stability and functionality of the system that got and preserves my money. That like like a lot of these types of initiatives have to do with like poor healthcare. Amongst a lot of populations, like, occasionally you see stuff that's even like really inarguably pretty nice. They'll do like free dental clinics in the, like the Kentucky hills. Just like take over a high school gym with like 40 dentist chairs and just people come in and just have their like rotting teeth pulled out, all day long. That have just been agony for people for weeks and weeks or months or years. And it's like, yeah, that's a pretty nice thing. But do they ever talk about stuff like Medicare for all or like increasing the top marginal tax rate to 90%, to be like, actually, the basic economic system that has enabled me to become fantastically wealthy is the major problem here. And why, in a sense, why all these people are so poor in the first place.
Exactly. And I think I think the key is not just that they're not doing enough, which is true, not just that, the goodwill of corporations or even these nonprofits or apps for charitable causes, not just that those are insufficient. They are, but also that the very systems and enterprises that people are pouring into to do these things are the very structures and enterprises that are causing the social problems and the suffering that these things are aiming to alleviate. So they're perpetuating the underlying causes of the symptoms they're treating and patting themselves on the back for it. Right. So the problem is, in part is one that allows power structures to solidify and hold their power because many people who would otherwise be perhaps part of the left and perhaps be down for more revolutionary radical forms of change are convinced that their participation in the system that's causing the problems is actually beneficent and helpful when fundamentally it's not altering anything.
Yeah. He goes through a great example of a woman called Amy Cuddy, who's a psychologist, a feminist, and she did a lot of like fairly radical work in terms of just gender discrimination and so forth. And he just tells the story basically of how she gave a TED talk on one like somewhat insubstantial part of her research, something that certainly wasn't central to what she had done, but it was about stances. It's like how to stand this, like whether standing in a certain way could sort of like ameliorate gender prejudice in businesses. And so, she ended up giving a TED talk on this and presented it in a sort of very self-helpy way to be like, oh yeah, if you stand like this, you will sort of increase your, something to do with like hormones and you'll feel more confident and, your pay gap will probably be decreased if you do this enough. And people just ate that shit up. It was kind of goofy.
I
Go ahead.
No, I think Steven Pinker has something running up his leg. What's the Chris Matthews line? Remember that?
Oh, your thrill runs up your leg. He was.
Yeah,
who was he talking about? He was talking about that hound dog looking guy who was on Law and Order.
I don't even remember. For some reason, I associated it with Obama or something, but I don't remember what it was. I just know that Steven Pinker got really, really happy, even if he wasn't listening to this podcast, which he's probably not. Let's be fair. I think when it just psychically kind of through the universe's ways of transmitting phenomena, whatever they might be, when you uttered the words that the kind of the hormonal body imbalance by the way you're standing will give rise to some force that could change, and make things more egalitarian, was exactly the kind of scientific rationalist basis for social change that he would love. So
yeah,
good work.
Absolutely. But anyway, it's like a process of this person becoming fairly wealthy and influential and like a hot commodity on the speaking circuit. She's charging like $40,000 to come in and give these presentations. But that money and that influence is predicated on her only saying this self-help bullshit about like how standing is going to undo sexism. And it's like, it's like, come on,
Well, to be fair, we went from standing to, leaning in. So if you stand first and then you lean in and you have the various gestures and movements of your body, that is actually part of the book's argument too, which is as long as the solutions are totally non-threatening and can happen at the individual level without any sacrifice of the elites or the moneyed class, that would be great. Yes, if everyone could just be self-reliant and have a good attitude and maybe eat your veggies, then everything will be okay.
Yeah.
So we have this devastating argument, but I think there's even more to it, right? Because I think it's no news that the Jeff Bezoses of the world are drinking their own Kool-Aid and the Elon Musks are toking their own weed. He probably grows his own weed, I assume.
Yeah.
But what is the significance other than excoriating? So I think that the point is that we're not just, as fun as it is, excoriating individual rich people for the kind of the rationalizing cognitive dissonance that they have to justify their own existence and how they're exploiting people to make their wealth. That's fine and true as far as it goes, but I think there's more that we can do with this text and this argument structurally to understand the danger and how it relates to, like you said, the individuals, not just that are getting successful off of TED Talks, but like the college student who considered herself an Aristotelian at the beginning of the book, Ms. Cohen. She was a do-gooder, might be a rabbi one day, and maybe was considering that. Instead, she takes a job at McKinsey, and she really, really wants to do good is the thing. And she's even steeped in the Aristotelian notion that money is not an end in itself and can lead to all these terrible ways that harm human flourishing within the polis. So literally a young idealistic person wants to do good, could not be more prime to help actually change the world. But even she gets bound up and caught within this snare of thinking that working for McKinsey will be the way to do it.
Yeah, and I think it's a process of. It seems to me like a you might call it a structural and an ideological form of legitimizing the status quo. So on the one hand, you just have this massive, effective propaganda apparatus, and I don't think it's consciously constructed, but it's just like through a sort of selection process of who gets funded and who doesn't, who gets the high-profile jobs and who doesn't, such that, you end up where you go to an elite school, you never hear about anything other than, going to work at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs is really the way to learn how to, do solutions or whatever. And then on the other side, you have the fact that working for McKinsey pays you fuck ton of money. You know, it's like you come out of Harvard, you're like 22 and you're making six figures right out of the gate.
But here's the more pernicious thing. The McKinsey people that interview and hire young college graduates like this Georgetown student, they know that they are idealistic, or a lot of them are anyway. And so they sold her a bill of goods about, we're going to actually change the world. We're the ones that have all these nonprofit and charitable causes that we're taking these young brains to work on. And we're going to actually be the cream of the crop when it comes to figuring out global problems and how to solve these crises. And sure enough, right, President Obama taps McKinsey to do just that. And so which is in one way totally confirming the logic, because that narrative and resource has permeated neoliberalism, including, the Democrats like Obama. And so she says at this point that she's both completely disillusioned, or not completely disillusioned, but she's both simultaneously disappointed and excited at this prospect, because she's excited to actually do something meaningful. At the same time, she's disheartened that Obama didn't go to say, community organizers in order to try to figure out how to change things.
Yeah.
So there's something really pervasive about who actually is called upon to suggest how to deal with social problems and ills, and then what the rationale and legitimizing myths are, narratives are, that perpetuate, the rationale for doing just that.
Yeah, and I think, the other side of the financial piece of it is, it's like, okay, you have this like very tempting salary you can offer to people who, let's be honest, do not deserve it in any way, shape, or form. But on the other hand, like all the, like, perhaps not all, but most of the, countervailing sources of, working to do something that is like what a somewhat naive 22-year-old college graduate might want to think about, like those have all just been like gutted in the last 10, 20, 30 years. So, probably most importantly, universities have gone from a place where it's like, okay, if I'm a bright person and I want to have a career in like doing good in some way, studying problems and so on and so forth, like that has really been badly undermined.
I think this is a very key point you're making, because it wasn't just the battle of the reactionaries who say, forget this do-gooder nonsense. We just want individual responsibility. All the other myths of Thatcher, Reagan, and the kind of calls for just keeping those do-gooders from harming our ability to be free, and greed is good, et cetera, et cetera. The thing that really devastated us was that the opposition party co-opted the resistance to that by saying, oh no, there's still a way to do good. Let's not lose our compassion, right? That as opposed to liberty and freedom being the locus of the ideological narrative, it's no, we're going to retain progress and compassion and care and community, but we're just going to privatize it. And we're going to just acknowledge that, the actual end of history is thinking that there is a locus for any action, whether it's about wealth maximization or social concern, that is outside of the market and outside of the expertise of, the private sphere that gives rise to innovation and solutions and all the technocratic bullshit that we talked about that bleeds over into those people who go public-private in their orientation, like the Clintons, right, who are the kind of epitome of this nonsense, which is to be good in government and to be prosperous in business, or to have the same skill sets and understandings of the world, right?
Yeah. And another perverse consequence of that, going back to the universities again, is that you have these public institutions which are supposed to be about public goods, public understanding, public education, get, badly undermined by austerity, the penetration of business logic into the university, and they end up fundraising from plutocrats. You have the Koch brothers just buying up whole economics departments wholesale. There's a big story about how George Mason University had basically entered into a secret arrangement with the Koch people that was like basically gave them hiring and firing control so that they would only appoint, far right-wing libertarian professors. And
but it's not just the right wingers. It's centrist liberals are also devastating higher education with neoliberalism. And whether it's the focus on STEM or whether it's the focus on just treating one of the areas of life that's supposed to be a public good, right? So this is very obvious. Health, healthcare, education, environment, and climate. These are things that are supposed to be public goods and not treated as commodities, just like we talked about with Polanyi and fictitious commodities. And yet the liberals, the neoliberals, want to treat higher education like a business and, create these, both the students are the customers, but also the products that are going to be crafted for these employers. And in fact, I have here, and I don't know if you want to talk about this now or in a minute, because I think we want to bring in Antonio Gramsci, don't we? As a way to perhaps better understand the theoretical underpinnings of this argument and why it might be helpful to us. But I have these ads that I was reading the New York Times Sunday edition today, the magazine, and the first couple ads that I turned to are just so exemplary in this pernicious neoliberal system. So I was talking about higher education, right? So the first thing I have here is a company, Gratify, I suppose, and you'll get a sense for what they do after I tell you what the ad is, right? But there's a picture of a young white girl who has a sweatshirt, and her sweatshirt has a $sign and 67,928 as the number on it. And then the ad reads, "Why did she borrow 67,928 for tuition?" And then below that it says, "She did it to work for you."
Jeez.
I swear to God,
Right.
I'm not even fucking joking. Why did she borrow 67,928 for tuition? She did it to work for you. And then below it says, "Now there's a job benefit that helps your employees pay off their student loans. Gratify is gratitude." and what this, I looked it up, what this business does is it's something that employers can do where you as an employee can direct some of your paycheck, just like an HSA account, for your health savings. You can have part of your paycheck go to pay off the student loans. The student loans that you took out so you could be a wage slave to the employer, and then you could thank the employer for taking some of your money out to pay the student loans that you took out so that you could be a wage slave for the employer. And it's gratitude. Then you'll be grateful. You'll be grateful to the employer that they will take your money automatically and pay down the student loans. And I swear to God, this is both encapsulating the beneficence, the noblesse oblige of the employers, and literally saying that education is all about creating a wage slave who will basically be happy that you're letting them pay back the loans that they took out so they could be your wage slave. It's amazing. It's so amazing. The next ad, I kid you not, that I turned to, the next page, "The world will change. This university is designed to change with it." And then it talks about this co-op program where students not only go to school, but they get internships with companies by embracing change, right? So it's talking about literally how the world will change because we're going to give you internships to help you get a job with these companies that are going to change the world. And then last but not least, literally the third ad in a row, that I find in this magazine. It's a wealth management company. I kid you not, this is what it reads. Every wealth strategy needs an end goal, like never-ending wealth.
There you go.
Every
MCM.
Every wealth strategy needs an end goal. Yeah, MCM, exactly. For all those read up on their marks, MCM. So, I don't know. That's just what was popping up in my New York Times magazine today. And I thought that might be relevant to our discussion.
I think this makes a good transition into our sort of thinker for the episode, Antonio Gramsci. He's a guy, he was an Italian communist who was a big, during the time of Lenin and the Russian Revolution, he was a basically a communist organizer in Italy. And so he ended up in jail after the fascists took power in Italy in 1922. And so he ended up there. And that's where he wrote his most famous books, which are the prison notebooks, just some kind of like semi-incomplete musings on communism and political economy and so on and so forth. But he has some very interesting things to say about, ideology, how a society's ruling class justifies itself, and how the citizenry may come to believe, may come to a consent to the rule of an elite, as opposed to just as opposed to the type of like a naked dictatorship where you just live in fear. He's talking about the kind of place where people actually come to think that their place in society is, at the bottom or maybe towards the middle type of thing, and that the rulers deserve to rule.
Absolutely. Like you might find in a putative democratic republic where theoretically we all are equal and have the ability to choose and influence policy. Why do we oppress ourselves is the question. And this is part of the answer. Why do we oppress ourselves, right?
Yeah. And I think that leads nicely into one of his key concepts, which is just the idea of ideology. And he talks about ideology as, I think in a fairly neutral sense, and as like a way that a kind of like social grouping makes sense of the world. One way that might be a way to illustrate it in a way that, sort of take it out of its modern context might be the idea of chivalry. Like this is very important ideology back in the, the Middle Ages, which legitimized the role of the aristocracy, because the idea was that the peasants would do the laboring, but then the aristocrats would do the fighting. That whenever there was any threat to the the security of the land, the fief or whatever, the lord's lands, then he would ride out on his horse and go do battle with the peoples, the invaders, and fight them off. Now, of course, this was like not exactly accurate way of describing the Middle Ages for the most part, but it also wasn't entirely inaccurate. And I think that gets to an important point about ideology, is that there's usually got to be a grain of truth in there to some degree. Ones that are just like total bullshit tend to fall apart. And in fact, that's what happened to chivalry when it became inarguable that that form of military especially was just like non-viable. The ideology of chivalry just crumbled and collapsed, and new ideologies came in to sort of like replace it. So yeah, that's one concept there. Any comments on
right?
that?
And yeah, so I think that's That's very important. That's good. You know, there's so much we could talk about with Gramsci and what he introduces to the left in terms of understanding how power sustains itself. And, you know, he's pushing against a few things. One thing he's pushing against is the kind of notion that there's this deterministic scientific materialism and this dialectic of kind of inevitable material progress to communism, and this notion that there, you know, it's about agency in a way, and about the ways that ideology and what is kind of sometimes referred to as a superstructure that's epiphenomenal or secondary, and not really at the core of how change occurs. How ideology actually can't be too disambiguated from the actual material practices and social relations in society. So in other words, he's got a complex project going on, but what he's trying to show is that politics and class struggle is not a separate thing from the ideas that people have and the narratives they have and the words they choose to help them make sense of the world. That involves also people for whom revolution or radical change would serve their interests. They can be persuaded through various mediums of civil society, whether it's art, whether it's the rhetoric of politicians, whether it's these magazine pages that I discussed before in the New York Times. Cultural hegemony is something he introduces as the kind of meta-narratives that we swim in often help the ruling class justify their own existence in the power structures, so that those who would otherwise be pushed to be political and fight for their interests don't realize what their interests really are, is my way of putting it, just my language. And so I think Gramsci is trying to get at a more nuanced, complicated sense of what the class struggle politically needs to involve and implicate. And it leads to an analysis of how all these different methods of informing the way people make sense of the world need to be kind of looked at politically to see how they might be working politically.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Cultural hegemony, it's this, this idea that like when it's working, when you have this like accomplished, you have it, such that like whoever happens to be in charge of society will, the rest of the population will believe that they will have internalized the, their sort of self-justifications, their ideology that they sort of propagate. And yeah, one I think very concrete example of this in action, which it continues to be relevant, is the idea of deficit, worrying about the national debt. And this is a thing which you could say concretely in the United States especially has no influence whatsoever on the lives of ordinary people. It's a phenomenon that is entirely internal to the the federal government, which has to issue these bonds and has to pay the interest, but particularly because the United States has the privilege of having the global reserve currency and therefore enormous demand for U.S. denominated assets, dollar denominated assets, that is. Like, it's just not something we've had to worry about basically since like at least the 1940s. And nevertheless, there's this massive anxiety over the national debt in a way that, it doesn't really have all that much force in terms of like people voting on it necessarily, but it is constantly spoken of in supposedly neutral journalism as being a national emergency. It's constantly polled. People are constantly informed about it. There's documentaries done. Pete Peterson, the former hedge fund guy who has since died, I think he spent like $500 million over a decade or two, basically on a bunch of institutes and publications. The major thrust of which was to say, you need to worry about the national debt. This is a big problem. And despite the fact that it's garbage economics, and it's really not something that you need to worry about at all.
It's related to the austerity, isn't it? That totally related to the way that austerity is pushed as being necessary when it has no real basis in economic fact in terms of being good for the economy, right? But there is this kind of smuggled in moral/normative ideology that, the actual masses have to be punished for the debt that they get into, whereas the elites can do whatever, right? Like the national debt's never a problem when it's for a war or when it's, basically bailing out the banks. So there's this continual logic that forces the narrative a certain way when it harms the elites or benefits the elites versus everyone else.
Yeah, right. And the reason is because, as you're saying, the worrying about the deficit militates against government spending on behalf of, basically the working class. And it's a convenient pretext for basically the like rich people to say that the government should not be doing anything about unemployment or poverty. Mikhail Kalecki, I believe, butchered that pronunciation again. He has a great phrase about that in his famous essay, "The Political Aspects of Full Employment," which is, this is why why business capitalists dislike full employment and particularly stimulus to restore employment in a depression, which is about, this worrying about confidence gives the business class a large influence over economic policy, which Kalecki says everything which may shake the state of confidence must be carefully avoided because it would cause an economic crisis. But once the government learns the trick of increasing unemployment by its own purchases, this powerful controlling device loses its effectiveness. Hence, budget deficits necessary to carry out government intervention must be regarded as perilous. The social function of the doctrine of sound finance is to make the level of employment dependent on the state of confidence. So this is very Gramsci reasoning, I think, to say that, people have an ideology, and they sort of, that has a major effect on how they view economic policy, legislation, the whole panoply of like stuff that can be done in politics. And in many cases, you can see things which have basically at bottom maybe an unconscious or a semi-conscious cynicism about them. And I think the austerity fetish over the last decade is absolutely all about that. It's all about inherent resistance to the idea that you can basically just spend and have no consequences. In fact, positive consequences at like restoring employment and production and growth in a way that has nothing to do with philanthropists, with big tech barons, with innovators, with thought leaders. It's a bunch of bureaucrats sitting in offices in Washington, D.C., writing checks and doing good things. And that is abhorrent to the people this fellow is writing in his book, Winner Take All.
It is no coincidence that, as Thomas Piketty shows in his 700 and something page volume, Capital in the 21st Century, as basically all the data, and the neoliberals love data. All the data shows that growing inequality is making the rich richer, and the richer you are, the richer it makes you, and the rest aren't. The rising tide isn't kind of lifting all boats at all. And so the legitimating myth before used to be, well, it's okay, and this is even Rawlsian in a liberal political philosophy sense. It's okay if there's growing inequality and if the rich get richer, so long as everyone in an absolute sense does better. And that's, that's justice. Well, that hasn't worked out in a while at all. So a new myth had to be created, and a new approach to this problem had to be created. So there's no doubt in my mind that, Jeff Bezos suddenly giving away a couple billion of his 60 or whatever $billion that he's worth for charity.
160.
Sorry, I undershot that by a lot. Wow. It's just at some point it becomes real money, I tell you.
Yeah.
The thing is, it's no surprise that philanthropy and kind of the elites recommending possibilities for helping out the poor and solving poverty. By the way, Winners Take All mentions very clever ways some of the strategic uses of their focus. So they don't focus on the root cause, or they don't focus on inequality, because that implicates, right, the class of people who are benefiting from the poverty and there are winners and losers in that framing, right? But if you focus just on poverty, then it could be about just those people and not about the exploiters and the winners. And even more so if you focus on, as you say, individuals and what individuals can do. And maybe we can help, it might have been wrong to tell them to lift themselves up from their bootstraps, which is physically impossible, but maybe we can innovate an app that helps them lift themselves up from their bootstraps. Anyway, so it's no coincidence that the narratives, and this is part of what Gramsci is saying, the ideology kind of adapts to the material conditions that are requiring different narratives to legitimate and justify the power structures as they are. And people are very good at coming up with these legitimating myths and narratives.
Yeah, definitely. Another one definitely worth that is very telling is the focus from the professional Democrats and the billionaire class, at least on the liberal side, is the just nutty obsession with education reform over the last decade. There's just been this unbelievable deployment of assets and wealth and effort into reforming education systems to make it, more productive. And I think that the evidence, from what I've seen, the evidence on all of those efforts is questionable at best. Mark Zuckerberg did this thing in New Jersey, I think Newark, right? And he spent like $100 million and just pissed it away. But bracketing the question of education, there's a larger question that's totally unanswerable, which is why education? Because if you just want to improve the lives of people and you have $160 billion, well, one thing you could do is just give them money. Or better yet, you could restructure the tax system such that they get more money and they get it from you. And that, obviously, is something that if you're a billionaire, you probably want to rule out from the start. And so one very nice, convenient little solution here is to say, these people aren't being victimized by the economic system. They just aren't being educated properly, and it's a perfect
They're
solution.
they're too dumb. They're too dumb to succeed is the problem. If only they were smart like us.
Yeah.
Those motherfuckers.
It's
They're
great.
too dumb to succeed. No. By the way, Coops, it's true that like beyond education, just help out people would be nice. But even in terms of education and what actually, if you're about the data, what actually leads to educational outcomes that are positive, the most clear data shows the only real statistically significant factor. Do you want to guess what it is? The only real statistically significant factor. I'll give you three guesses. What is the number one statistically significant factor when they look at what the correlation is between educational outcomes and what gives rise to them? What would you guess?
I would guess income of the parents.
Yes, household income. That's it. That's the one thing.
Yeah.
If we look at the household income, we have a pretty good chance at guessing what the educational outcomes will be.
Yeah.
So even giving money to the people beyond just helping them generally also achieves whatever education goals better than this, ridiculousness that has been generated with all these various experiments, right?
Yeah, yeah. But it's the perfect solution for the guilty billionaire because it suggests that the problem lies within the individual. But it's also not their fault because they don't have access to the quality education that you would need if you want to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. So you get to sort of have your cake and eat it too in terms of egalitarian thinking. The problem is that it's bullshit. It's just like it's completely ridiculous in terms of policy or just prioritization.
It's funny. Anand in Winners Take All talks about how win-win is really kind of the language of the Silicon Valley class, if you will.
Market world.
And so he writes, yes, the market world do-gooders. They're all about the win-win. And I mean, really the win-win is about them doing well and thinking that they're serving the public. But here's the quote that I think is really useful for understanding the impetus for how narratives are created amongst this class, right? So, quote, the entrepreneurs were willing to participate in making the world better if you pursued that goal in a way that exonerated and celebrated and depended on them. Win-win.
Yeah.
So as long as the way to progress and to helping people exonerates and exculpates those moneyed, that moneyed class, and then furthermore depends on them and their genius, right? And their will and their generosity, which as we see in many corresponding legitimating penchants like David Brooks and various others who love the fact that they can tip at restaurants, because when they tip, they get to really show their noblesse oblige and show their generosity to those beneath them. It's that same notion, right? They get to feel good about the bad they're doing, essentially. But the thing is, that wouldn't work unless the people that are getting those tips and that are, benefiting from those Bill Gates Foundation programs buy into the logic and the narrative of Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, all these people as the good guys. And oh my goodness, look at all that money he just gave. So the pernicious and dangerous thing is that they're very successful. Maybe not to the Trump and Bernie supporters, but to a whole wide swath of centrist liberals and others that buy into this, both for themselves to participate in, but also to laud their heroes, these great individuals that are trying to save us, like Elon Musk.
Yeah. However, though, I think it's this is a good point to introduce another Gramscian idea, which is the war of position. And this, because I think this, the Winner Take All book, it's a picture of an ideology that had sort of cultural hegemony status and is losing it now. I think it's this sort of ideological structure is falling apart, and it's falling apart because it's just like it's running too hard into the the shoals of reality, basically, I think. And it's just really implausible to people. It's after the 2008 crisis, people, just looking at this carnage caused by financial capitalism, and people think like, maybe we need different ideas. And so Gramsci says that, one of the tasks of a working class movement is to sort of articulate an alternative ideology, an alternative, picture of how society works that is comprehensible to everyone, that can sort of like take root and fill the gap left by the collapsing hegemonic ideology. And he has this phrase he likes a lot: organic intellectual. And by that he means like basically anyone who has any sort of like thinking job at all, and that could be like a teacher or a journalist or a professor or a, even just like someone who like talks about politics at work.
Podcaster.
Yeah, potentially. And so obviously that's an appealing idea to someone who is a journalist and a podcaster, but I think it's true that I think this is a thing that needs to be done, because there have been a lot of cases in which, some kind of left-wing or radical movement has, taken a sudden success and then kind of retreated for lack of confidence about what should be done. How do you proceed? And I think that it is
That's a good point.
A somewhat minor task to like set up those, those sort of roadways for people to go forward through. But I think it's a necessary one. Like there's got to be a way for people to grasp and for, policies to implement, ways for people to feel confident about going forward, as opposed to just sort of like inchoate resentment about
there
stuff.
has to be a narrative. There has to be a way to make sense of both the diagnosis and the prescription, like what's happening, that's the problem, and what the answer is. I mean, Gramsci actually saw this himself. He saw the workers physically take the means of production over, and then after they did that, didn't think they knew what to do with it. They had this problem of like, I think these other people that had power before know what they're doing more, and so they like willingly gave back the power they took because they didn't have that apparatus intellectually to move them forward. So there is this important political connection between ideology and political theory and the actual activism on the ground that helps take the power back. So yeah, that can't just be left to the cultural narratives that are part and parcel of the hegemonic power structures. And this includes art. This includes, I don't know if you wanted to talk about this, but like, I don't know if we'll play the clip of Elon Musk on Stephen Colbert, but Colbert compares him to Tony Stark.
You people have called you the real Tony Stark. Are you sincerely trying to save the world?
Well, I'm trying to do good things, yeah. Saving the world is not.
But you're trying to do good things and you're a billionaire.
Yeah.
That seems a little bit like either superhero or supervillain. You have to choose one.
I'm trying to do useful things.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And he's like, you are the real world Tony Stark, right? And so Tony Stark, of course, super popular Marvel comic character, which does what politically? It makes people think that the heroes, the people who are great and the ones that will save us, are those kind of individual idiot savant engineers like Elon Musk who are exceptional, and that kind of feeds into this notion that I think is part and parcel of the cultural hegemony we have now, which is the fucking elites, right? They can, whether it's on Wall Street with the derivatives and the risk taking that they did, or whether it's the Elon Musks, the Steve Jobs, rest his soul, those assholes can take as much risk as they want. Actually, they're the geniuses who are rewarded for risk taking. In fact, their risk taking is fucking like laudatory and like, wow, look how brave they are and look how audacious in their ideas they are, right? So like we have this narrative that rewards them and spurs them on to take risk. Meanwhile, they're not bearing any risk, actually. They have no actual risk when they do these fucking things. In fact, the risk is socialized. Like when Wall Street collapsed in 2008, we bear the consequences of those risky ventures not working out. However, when normal working class people have to consider, oh, can I leave my job if that's how my health insurance is delivered? Oh no, I better not risk that. And then when people are poor, they're punished, or when they lose their job, they're punished and blamed. And the narrative is, well, you shouldn't have taken that risk. You should have been more responsible. Right. And so just the same way that like Martin Luther King pointed out the crazy logic of nonviolence being rewarded when it's the citizens doing nonviolence. But when the state is being violent in Vietnam and Martin Luther King still says, hey, you shouldn't do that, they're like, no, that's weakness. When the state is violent, it's strength. And when citizens are violent, it's bad, right? So it's the same like ideological flexibility that that we need to combat. That's we have to change people's understanding and consciousness about these things as much as we need to get them to organize at their work, right?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note here that at least according to Gramsci, and I think this is a healthy way of thinking about it. If you are an intellectual, in the Gramscian sense, the idea is to articulate, the interests of the working class in a way that the other members maybe can't do for themselves. The idea is not to sort of like push your own ideology onto people and try to like basically rewrite their sort of thinking. I mean, I think that's like a somewhat questionable idea, but I think
it's tricky.
At the least, it's a good thing to try to do. You are trying to represent people. You're not trying to dominate them.
So it's look. I have this. Believe it or not, it just occurs to me that fine line you're drawing between imposing ideological frameworks on people rather than helping others situate their experiences, their thoughts, their feelings in an articulated way that you could, like, one of my favorite poets is a Greek poet, Odysseus Elitis, Nobel laureate, brilliant lefty. And so he says to each his own weapons, presumably in the battle, right, for liberation. And so intellectuals have a certain weapon that they can use. And I find myself in the classroom having this kind of line to walk that you mentioned a little bit. So, for example, there's a line between a student articulating something and me trying to convince them otherwise, or trying to push on them an understanding that I want them to have, versus me sussing out. And again, it's a little patronizing, but I am the professor, they are a student. But like in this situation, I do try to recognize what somebody's trying to say and help give them the language that can articulate the thing that I think they're trying to say in a way that is fruitful. And there is definitely that kind of art to not simply imposing in a ham-fisted way what I want them to think. Yeah.
And I would further add that, when it comes to, if you're going to like do a strike, I would imagine in today's day and age, having someone who could sort of articulate the interests of like McDonald's employees in a comprehensible way is a lot less important and necessary than the rank and file people who are brave enough to like go on strike and so forth. You know,
Right.
There is a need for both things. You do need your sort of learned apparatus, but you also need, you know, maybe more importantly, as just a sort of like necessary but not sufficient part of even getting some sort of working class project off the ground, the people who will actually, you know, step on the, you know, go on strike or work stoppage or whatever, and take that risk, which may be, you know, considerably greater if that's all you have in terms of money. So, you know, it's not really a self-aggrandizing project either, I would say, in its best form.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a role and it's almost beside the point to adjudicate like what role is more important, and that's almost just not what needs to be focused on at all. But I mean, there, you know, it's just, I guess as much as it's important for the left to understand how it needs to argue against these narratives and do that work, exposing, so as much as we need counter narratives and counter hegemonic ideologies to perpetuate, simply exposing the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses and the Bill Clintons and those frauds for what they are is an important service and necessary condition for mobilizing the masses we need to mobilize to make fundamental change happen, I think. And like you said, we're in a time when if we don't do it, guess who's going to do it? Like the Steve Bannons of the world understand. Look, the fucking Democrats, right? Even after Trump wins, they start propping up a Kennedy. They talk about Bloomberg and Oprah, these fucking rich assholes who they still don't get it. They still don't get it. And no. Bannon gets it. I mean, the right-wing populists, they get it. They get the need for a new narrative. Trump gets it. And if we don't, on the left, come up with our own meaningful, articulated narrative, both of the problem with the elites and the solution, boy, oh boy, aren't we going to cede a lot of power to the fucking fascists.
Yeah, I mean, in this, perhaps as just a concluding comment here, because we're getting on time, but one thing about, you know, that maybe Gramsci was not so clear on was that you really can just manipulate people. Like that is a possibility, to just believe absolute nonsense. You know, demagogues are a thing. And yeah, as you say, you know, somebody's going to have to step up to replace the Trumps and the, you know, Bolsonaros and the Putins of the world to provide an alternative vision for society. Because otherwise, you know, people will just play the society's darkest impulses like a Fisher-Price piano keyboard.
Yeah, and that basic narrative has to be, if you think it's too good to be true, it probably is. No, the world will not benefit from you making a shit ton of money and feeling good about it. And yes, we probably have to sacrifice in order for everyone to do better. And sorry, no, the invisible hand and market fundamentalism are not this beautiful, beneficent, self-regulating thing. And there's any number of things that we can push. But thankfully, I think there are those there that are ready to do it. And politicians, it seems, who are also ready to listen to the activists, forcing them and pushing them to fight for those new narratives. So
that's good.
I think, let's do it. Let's continue to do it.
Absolutely. So
all
basically,
right,
the way to revolution is to keep listening to this podcast.
Mostly the downloads is the thing, and you spread the word. You are helping the revolution by downloading us. Wait, no, that's not, something wrong with that. I don't know.
But thanks for listening. We'll be seeing you soon.
All right, everybody. Bye-bye.